The Vance Ranch was a jewel carved from the raw and forgiving heart of the Arizona Territory. Nestled deep within a valley where the Apache Mountains softened into rolling hills, it was a place of impossible greens against the ochre dust, fed by a spring that whispered promises of prosperity. For Eleanor Vance, it wasn't just land, it was a dream, built from sweat and love, brick by arduous brick, hope by enduring hope. She stood on the porch, a wide, planked expanse that overlooked their burgeoning cattle herd, her hand resting lightly on the weathered wood. The scent of pine and sage mingled with the faint, comforting aroma of wood smoke from their stone chimney. Her husband, John, was out mending a distant fence line, his familiar whistle carrying on the morning breeze. Eleanor smiled, a soft, content curve of her lips. At 28, her face, though etched with the faint lines of sun and wind, held a vibrant beauty, framed by practical, braided brown hair. She was strong, capable, her hands calloused from years of working alongside John, but her eyes held a warmth, a deep, biting love that shone like the clear desert sky. John Vance was a good man, as honest as the day was long, with a laugh that could chase away any shadow. He was strong, fair, and fiercely dedicated to their shared vision. They had come to this remote valley with nothing but grit and a few dollars, carving out their ranch from the tamed wilderness, believing in the promise of a future forged by their own hands. Their herd was growing, their small cabin expanding, and in Eleanor's heart, a fragile hope for a family was beginning to bloom. The sun was high when Eleanor saw the dust cloud. At first, she dismissed it as a passing wagon, or perhaps a few errant cattle. But then, the dust grew, mushrooming into an angry plume that rushed towards their valley with alarming speed. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a wagon. This was trouble. Her hand instinctively went to the heavy iron skillet that always hung by the door. Then she saw them. A dozen riders, perhaps more, dark shapes against the blazing sky, moving with a brutal, predatory precision. They weren't travelers. They were raiders, outlaws. And at their head, a figure on a jet-black horse, unmistakable even from this distance, a man of imposing height, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but his aura radiating cold, merciless intent. "John!" Eleanor screamed, her voice tearing through the peaceful morning, a desperate, futile warning. John, hearing the urgency in her voice, appeared from around the barn, his rifle already in hand. He saw the approaching horde, his eyes widening in grim realization. "Get inside, now! Bar the door! Get the shotgun!" He moved with frantic speed, knowing their time was short. He tried to reach her, to pull her into the relative safety of the cabin, but the riders were too fast. They descended upon the ranch like a plague, a cacophony of thundering hooves, harsh shouts, and the ominous glint of steel. John fired his rifle, a single, defiant shot that took down one of the lead riders, who tumbled from his horse with a sickening thud. But he was one man against a dozen. The gang swarmed him, their faces masked by bandanas, their eyes glinting with a savage joy. Eleanor watched, frozen in horror, as they disarmed John, then beat him mercilessly. She saw the leader, the man on the black horse, dismount with a chilling calm. He approached John, who lay bleeding in the dust, defiant even in defeat. "This land belongs to us now, rancher," the leader sneered, his voice a low, gravelly growl that sent shivers down Eleanor's spine. He kicked John once, hard, then drew a gleaming bowie knife. "No!" Eleanor shrieked, finally breaking free of her paralysis. She grabbed the skillet and charged, a wild, desperate scream tearing from her throat, intent on striking the man down. But two of the outlaws intercepted her, seizing her roughly, dragging her back. She fought, kicked, bit, a furious wildcat, but they were too strong, too many. They held her, forcing her to watch, her eyes wide with terror and a rising, suffocating agony. The leader, indifferent to her struggles, plunged his knife into John's chest, once, then again. John's eyes, fixed on Eleanor, flickered, a silent plea, final, agonizing farewell. Then, they glazed over, dull and lifeless. The last spark of her world extinguished. Eleanor's scream ripped through the air, raw and primal, a sound of utter devastation. She collapsed, her body limp in the outlaw's grasp, her mind shattered. They dragged her roughly, heedless of her broken spirit, and threw her to the ground near the burning barn. The outlaws ransacked their home, smashing furniture, tearing through belongings. They drove off their cattle, a bellowing, dusty horde disappearing over the hills. Then, with cruel, deliberate glee, they set fire to the cabin. Flames erupted, licking greedily at the dry wood, consuming years of dreams in moments. The smoke choked Eleanor, but she barely noticed. Her gaze was fixed on the inferno, on the rising plumes of black, bitter ash that carried away everything she had loved. The leader, his dark eyes surveying the destruction with cold satisfaction, approached her one last time. He kicked John's body, lying still in the dust, then spat on it. "This is a warning," he snarled, his voice chillingly calm. "Don't come back. There's nothing left for you here." He then tossed John's blood-stained hat, a worn Stetson that Eleanor had bought him years ago, onto her lap. It was a final, sickening gesture of contempt. Then, as suddenly as they had arrived, they rode off, disappearing back into the dust cloud, leaving Eleanor alone amidst the smoldering ruins. The silence that followed was deafening, a vast, hollow emptiness that echoed the desolation in her soul. She lay there for what felt like an eternity, the heat of the burning cabin searing her skin, the stench of ash and death filling her nostrils. But gradually, something shifted within her. The searing grief began to twist, to curdle, transforming into a cold, hard knot of pure, unadulterated hatred. Her hands, trembling, reached for John's hat. She clutched it, pressing the blood-stained felt against her cheek. Her tears, once a river of sorrow, dried, leaving behind a burning fire in her eyes. She looked at the smoldering remains of her home, at the spot where John lay, at the vanishing dust cloud. They had taken everything. Her man, her home, her future. They had left her nothing but ash. But in that ash, an oath was forged, harder than steel, hotter than any forge. An oath of vengeance. They thought they had extinguished her spirit. They were wrong. They had only transformed it. From the dust and the burning, the widow Vance would rise, and she would ride for blood. The morning sun, usually a source of comfort, now felt like a harsh and welcome interrogation, laying bare the brutal aftermath of the raid. Eleanor rose from the ashes, her body stiff and aching, but her spirit, though shattered, held the core of unyielding resolve. Her eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, no longer wept. The well of tears had dried, replaced by a cold, burning emptiness. She knelt beside John's body, already stiff and cold. The sight of his pale, lifeless face, the gaping wound in his chest, sent a fresh wave of agony through her, but she pushed it down, burying it beneath layers of grief and vengeance. She couldn't afford to break. Not now. Not ever. With hands still trembling, she dragged John's body away from the smoldering ruins. The ground was hard and yielding, but she found a relatively softer patch near the stream where they used to sit on warm evenings, dreaming of their future. With a shovel she found miraculously intact in the wreckage of the barn, she began to dig. It was arduous, back-breaking labor, each scoop of earth a testament to her profound loss and her burgeoning fury. She buried him without a coffin, without a prayer. Just a simple mound of earth, marked by a cross fashioned from the burnt planks of their home. She placed John's blood-stained head on top, a silent monument to the man she loved, and to the life they had lost. "I swear to you, John," she whispered, her voice raw, "I will find them. Every last one of them. And I will make them pay." The vow, forged in ash and blood, cemented her purpose. With nothing left but the clothes on her back, a burning oath in her heart, and the haunting images of John's murder seared into her mind, Eleanor began to walk. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to leave this place of death, and she had to find a way to honor her vow. She walked for days, a lone, gaunt figure traversing the vast, indifferent desert, fueled by meager rations of wild berries and the unquenchable fire of her rage. She eventually stumbled into Redemption Creek, a dusty, ramshackle town clinging to the edge of civilization. It was a place of weathered facades, creaking saloons, and wary eyes. The sign on the sheriff's office was faded, the paint peeling, much like the hope it offered. Sheriff Brody was a man whose shoulders seemed perpetually slumped under the weight of his badge and the endless troubles of the territory. His face was a roadmap of cynical weariness, his eyes tired and haunted. He sat behind a cluttered desk, spitting tobacco juice into a nearby cuspidor, as Eleanor recounted her horrific tale, her voice devoid of emotion, a chillingly flat recitation of brutal facts. Brody listened, his gaze impassive, occasionally grunting. When she finished, The silence in the small office was thick with unspoken skepticism. "Ma'am," he finally said, his voice slow and deliberate, "I hear what you're saying, and I'm truly sorry for your loss. But this powerful gang you speak of sounds like a tall tale. No one just rides in and wipes out a ranch like that without leaving a trace." "They left a trace, Sheriff," Eleanor retorted, her voice hardening. "They left my husband dead, and my home in ashes. They stole every head of cattle we owned. And I saw them. I saw their leader, a tall man, on a black horse." Brody shook his head. "Ma'am, outlaws ride black horses all over the territory. And a dozen men? That's a small army. If a gang of that size was operating, I'd have heard about it. My resources are stretched thin. I've got 2 deputies, and a whole county to cover. Without more tangible evidence, there's little I can do." Eleanor stared at him, a cold realization dawning. He wasn't just unhelpful, he was deliberately dismissive. Was he afraid? Or worse, was he compromised? A flicker of the old anger sparked in her. "So, justice means nothing in Redemption Creek," Brody sighed, running a hand over his grizzled beard. "Justice, Mum, is a luxury few can afford out here, especially against shadows. My advice, go back east. Forget this. Start over." Eleanor stood, her spine stiff. "I have nothing to go back to, Sheriff, and I will never forget." She turned to leave, her heart filled with a fresh wave of despair. The law, it seemed, was as barren as the desert itself. As she stepped back onto the dusty street, a gaunt, ancient prospector, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, shuffled up to her. His eyes, though rheumy, held a sharp, knowing glint. "Don't trust the law in this town, little lady," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "Some folks got long pockets and short memories, especially when it comes to certain outfits." Eleanor stopped, her gaze fixed on him. "What outfits?" He leaned closer, his breath smelling of stale whiskey and tobacco. "Heard whispers, see, of a man called the Shadow, moves like smoke, strikes like lightning. Got himself a crew of ruthless dogs. Steals cattle, claims land. Never leaves a witness. Heard he's backed by someone big. Someone with a badge even." He paused, his eyes darting towards the sheriff's office. "But it's just whispers, mind. Old man's ramblings." He then shuffled away, disappearing into the shadows of a saloon. The words hung in the air, chilling Eleanor to the bone. The shadow, and the implication of corruption, of a lawman's complicity. Her despair now mingled with a renewed, sharpened resolve. If the law wouldn't help her, she would become the law. She walked towards the general store, her gaze determined. She had nothing, truly nothing. But she had John's memory, her oath, and a small, lingering fire of hope. She entered the store, her eyes scanning its meager offerings. She needed a horse. She needed a gun. She needed to learn how to use them. The journey for justice would begin not with a badge, but with a bullet. She would sell everything, even the last tangible links to her old life, to forge her new one. The general store in Redemption Creek was a dim, dusty haven of last resorts, filled with the scent of cured leather, stale coffee, and desperation. Eleanor Vance, her heart a cold stone in her chest, approached the proprietor, a portly man with shrewd, calculating eyes. She laid out her meager possessions on the worn wooden counter. John's prized saddle, exquisitely crafted and lovingly maintained, a faded, but beautifully embroidered shawl, a gift from her mother, and finally, with a heavy sigh that tore at her soul, her simple gold wedding band, the only piece of her old life she still possessed that held any monetary value. "I need to sell these," she stated, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, "for whatever you can give me." The proprietor's eyes gleamed as he examined the saddle, his fingers tracing the fine leather. "Good piece of work," he grunted. "Fetch you $30. He looked at the shawl. "5 for that." He then picked up the wedding band, turning it over in his hand. "Pure gold." "Another 20. $65. It was a paltry sum for the entirety of her past, but in this desolate corner of the world, it was a fortune. Eleanor nodded, a tight knot forming in her stomach. Each item sold felt like another piece of John, another piece of her old self, slipping away. But this was necessary. This was the price of her new path. With the money clutched tightly in her hand, she began her transformation. She bought a sturdy, though unglamorous, Roan mare, a beast of burden more than a swift steed, but hardy and reliable. She named her shadow in grim irony. She then bought a used but well-maintained Colt .45 revolver, its heavy weight feeling alien yet strangely comforting in her palm. A box of ammunition, a practical, unadorned leather holster, and a simple, dark riding duster completed her purchases. The duster, long and heavy, would conceal her form, lending her an air of anonymity and purpose. The next few weeks were a brutal, solitary apprenticeship. Eleanor sought out the most remote stretches of the desert, far from prying eyes, where she could practice. She taught herself to shoot, the recoil of the Colt jarring her wrist, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling her nostrils. She started awkwardly, missing more often than hitting, her hands trembling. But with each spent casing, with each blister on her palm, her aim grew steadier, her movements more fluid. She pictured the faces of John's killers in her mind, a powerful, venomous motivation. She rode Shadow relentlessly, pushing herself and the horse to their limits, learning the terrain, the subtle language of the desert. She learned to track, to read signs in the dust, to distinguish between a casual passing and a purposeful trail. She spent hours honing her skills, practicing quick draws, learning to reload under pressure. Every waking moment was dedicated to her metamorphosis. Her appearance also changed. The practical braids were replaced by hair cut short, almost boyish, so it wouldn't hinder her during a fight. Her soft, feminine dresses were replaced by sturdy denim trousers and plain shirts, hidden beneath the anonymous duster. She practiced moving silently, disappearing into shadows, becoming a creature of the desert herself. The kind, gentle Eleanor Vance was shedding her skin, revealing the hardened, vengeful widow beneath. One sweltering afternoon, as she practiced her drawl, a lone rider approached her camp. He was a grizzled, taciturn man named Silas, a retired bounty hunter who sometimes passed through Redemption Creek. He had a reputation for being a man of few words, but sharp eyes and an even sharper shot. He had seen her practicing from a distance, drawn by the repeated crack of gunfire. He dismounted slowly, his gaze assessing. "You got a reason to be making all that noise, girl," he drawled, his voice raspy. Eleanor didn't flinch. She kept her hand near her Colt, her eyes narrowed. "I've got a reason for everything I do." Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You're mighty green, but you got grit. Seen that fire before." "What's it for?" Eleanor hesitated. Then the words came, brand and varnish. "They killed my husband, stole my ranch, and the law did nothing." Silas nodded slowly. "I heard about that Vance ranch. Nasty business. Sheriff Brody ain't worth the tin on his badge when it comes to the real trouble." "You after the Shadow, then?" Eleanor's breath hitched. "The Shadow, the name from the old prospector. You know him?" "Whispers," Silas replied, "just whispers. But they say he's a ghost. Hard to track, harder to kill. And he's got connections, deep ones. The kind that make even the bravest men look the other way." He spat a stream of tobacco juice. "You're heading into a storm, little lady. You got any idea how to survive it?" Eleanor met his gaze, and flinching. "I'm learning. And I'm not alone. John rides with me." Silas studied her for a long moment, a flicker of something that might have been admiration, or perhaps pity, in his eyes. "You got heart, I'll give you that. But heart ain't enough to face the Shadow. You need more than a quick draw. You need cunning. And you need to be willing to get dirty." He paused. "I ain't looking for trouble, but I ain't looking for a grave either. Tell you what, I'll give you a few pointers, for old time's sake. Don't ask me why." And so, Silas became her reluctant, gruff mentor. He taught her how to track like a wolf, how to move through the desert unseen, how to manage her limited resources, and most importantly, how to shoot with cold, deadly precision. He drilled her relentlessly, pushing her beyond her perceived limits, his tough lessons forging her into something harder, sharper. He taught her about the codes of the underworld, the types of men she would face, and how to anticipate their moves. He also shared more whispers about the Shadow, that he operated out of a lawless settlement known as Rattlesnake Gulch, a den of thieves and killers, and that he had a distinctive, ornate silver spur on his left boot. Under Silas's tutelage, Eleanor Vance was meticulously transformed. The widow consumed by grief became the hunter, her purpose singular, her resolve absolute. She was no longer just a woman seeking vengeance. She was a force of nature, untamed and deadly, ready to ride the path of blood that stretched before her. Her training complete, Silas gave her a grim nod of approval. "You're ready as you'll ever be, girl. But remember, once you start down this path, there's no turning back." Eleanor knew this already. There was only one direction for her now: forward, into the heart of darkness, to claim the justice that had been denied. The dust of Redemption Creek was behind her, a swirling memory of indifference and broken promises. Before Eleanor Vance lay the vast, indifferent expanse of the Arizona Territory, a canvas of endless possibilities and unforgiving dangers. She was no longer Eleanor, the rancher's wife, but the widow, a creature born of ash and sorrow, riding a path of vengeance as ancient as the mountains themselves. Her roan mare, Shadow, moved with a steady, tireless gait, carrying her deeper into the wilderness. Silas's gruff lessons echoed in her mind: always watch the horizon, read the dust, never trust a quiet wind. Eleanor applied every teaching, every warning, every hard-won skill. Her senses were heightened, sharpened by grief and purpose. She wasn't merely observing the desert, she was becoming a part of it, learning its subtle language, anticipating its treachery. Her first lead was tenuous, a thread woven from the old prospector's whispers and Silas's grudging insights. The Shadow and his gang, she learned, were known for hitting isolated ranches, then moving the stolen cattle through a series of temporary holding pens, small, makeshift corrals scattered across forgotten trails. One such trail, a faint game path leading towards the remote region known as the Dead Horse Badlands, was her starting point. Silas had hinted that one of the Shadow's lower-tier men, a greasy, quick-tempered brute named Stumpy for his missing two fingers, often oversaw these initial movements. Eleanor rode for days, pushing Shadow and herself to their limits. Her water skin was constantly low, her provisions meager, but the burning hunger for justice gnawed deeper than any physical craving. She practiced her shooting at every opportunity, the cold point for .5 becoming an extension of her will. She learned to load on horseback, to fire from an awkward angle, to hit a target even as her horse bucked. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and strong, her fingers quick and sure. Finally, late one afternoon, she found a sign. Not a clear trail, but a discarded tin of sardines near a dried-up creek bed, a brand too specific for a lone prospector. Further on, a faint hoofprint, oddly shaped, almost like a clubfoot, a detail Silas had mentioned as peculiar to one of Stumpy's horses. The hunter in her awakened, a cold, focused intensity that pushed aside all other thoughts. She followed the trail, now clear to her trained eye, through winding arroyos and over rocky hills. As twilight began to paint the sky in hues of purple and orange, she saw him, Stumpy. He was alone, driving a small herd of rustled cattle towards a hidden corral in a secluded canyon. He was a brute of a man, wide-shouldered, with a perpetually sour expression, his two missing fingers a stark reminder of some past violence. Eleanor dismounted silently, tying Shadow to a scrub oak. She moved like a phantom, using the deepening shadows and uneven terrain as cover, closing the distance between them. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation and dread. This was her first target, the first step on her blood-soaked path. Stumpy, oblivious to the silent hunter, cursed at a wayward steer, kicking at its flank. He was distracted, complacent. Eleanor drew her Colt, the weight familiar, comforting. Her aim was true, honed by countless hours of practice and fueled by the raw memory of John's dying gaze. "Stumpy," she called out, her voice low, raspy, disguised by the dust and the distance. He spun around, startled, his hand instinctively going for the Schofield revolver holstered at his hip. But Eleanor was faster. Her bullet hit the dirt just inches from his boot, kicking up a puff of dust. He froze, his eyes wide with surprise and a sudden, dawning fear. He hadn't expected to be ambushed, and certainly not by a woman. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled, his eyes darting around, searching for the unseen assailant. Eleanor stepped out from behind a stand of mesquite, her duster billowing, her face shrouded by the brim of her hat. She held the Colt steady, pointed directly at his chest. "I'm the woman whose husband you murdered, whose ranch you burned, and whose cattle you stole." Stumpy stared, a flicker of recognition, then fear, crossing his brutal features. "The Vance woman. No, you ain't supposed to be alive." I'm very much alive, Eleanor hissed, her voice a low, dangerous growl. And I remember your face, Stumpy. I remember the look in your eyes when you laughed as my home burned. I remember you kicking my husband's body. He tried to bluster, to dismiss her. You're just a woman. You ain't gonna do nothing. Eleanor didn't respond with words. She raised her Colt slightly, adjusted her aim, and fired again. The bullet struck the ground directly between his feet, sending shards of rock flying. Stumpy yelped, a sound of genuine terror. Where is the shadow? Eleanor demanded, her voice laced with an icy fury. Where do you take the cattle? Who else was with you at the ranch? Stumpy, realizing she wasn't bluffing, realizing the cold, deadly resolve in her eyes, began to crack. He stammered, his eyes darting wildly. The fear of death, stark and immediate, was a powerful motivator. He gave her names, approximate locations, details about the gang's movements, their usual haunts. The men who rode with the shadow. He confirmed that their main stronghold was indeed Rattlesnake Gulch, a lawless haven deep in the Badlands. He even described a distinctive silver spur worn by the shadow, a detail that matched Silas's whispers. Eleanor listened, absorbing every word, her mind a steel trap. He gave her enough. More than enough. As he finished, pleading for his life, Eleanor looked at him, her face impassive. She saw no remorse, only fear. And she remembered John's dying eyes. You won't live to hurt another soul, she said, her voice chillingly calm. Stumpy's eyes widened, a desperate plea forming on his lips. But before he could utter a sound, Eleanor squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the canyon, a sharp, final punctuation mark. Stumpy crumpled, a lifeless heap in the dust, his Schofield and fired. Eleanor stood over him, the gun still smoking in her hand. Her body trembled, a tremor that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the profound, terrible weight of what she had just done. She had taken a life. It was brutal. It was final. But as she looked at Stumpy's lifeless form, she felt no regret, only a cold, hard satisfaction. This was justice. Her justice. And this was only the beginning. She had just stepped onto a path from which there was no return. The hunt had begun, and the widow rode for blood. The desert night descended, a vast, star-dusted blanket that offered both solitude and menace. Eleanor buried Stumpy beneath a cairn of rocks, a practical act to deter scavengers rather than an act of reverence. She spent the night hidden amongst the canyon's shadows, the scent of gunpowder clinging to her clothes, the echo of the gunshots still ringing in her ears. Sleep was elusive, haunted by the grim satisfaction of her first kill and the phantom image of John's face. With the dawn, a new resolve solidified within her. Stumpy's crude confessions had given her a roadmap, a name for the beast, and its lair, Rattlesnake Gulch. But she knew that simply riding and guns blazing was suicide. The shadow commanded a ruthless gang, and a frontal assault by a lone woman was an act of suicidal folly. She needed more information. She needed to understand the web of corruption and fear that protected him. Eleanor headed towards a remote trading post, the grimy, forgotten speck on the map called the Crossroads, where Silas had said independent prospectors and shady characters often exchanged information. She rode cautiously, her senses alert, her Colt always within easy reach. Her duster, now a cloak of anonymity, became her second skin. The Crossroads was even more dilapidated than Redemption Creek. A single, ramshackle saloon served as its heart, surrounded by a few dusty shacks and a blacksmith's forge. The air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey, horse sweat, and simmering violence. Eleanor dismounted, her movements deliberate, her eyes scanning every face. She knew she stood out, a woman alone in such a place, but she moved with a quiet authority that deterred casual harassment. She chose a corner table in the saloon, ordering a whiskey, letting the burn of the alcohol sharpen her focus. She listened, her ears picking up fragments of conversations, whispers of names and deals. She watched the men, their rough faces, their quick hands, trying to discern who might know something, who might be connected to the shadow. She overheard two grizzled prospectors arguing about a recent claim jumping, mentioning the shadow's enforcers. Another conversation, in hushed tones, hinted at a shipment of stolen goods heading towards Rattlesnake Gulch. The pieces of the puzzle, slow and agonizing, began to assemble. Eleanor knew she needed to engage, but carefully. She had learned from Silas to present an image, a persona. She was a lone traveler, hardened by the trail, but not overtly hostile. She cultivated an air of weary independence, letting her silence speak volumes. Her patience was rewarded when a scrawny, nervous man with darting eyes, nursing a warm beer, finally noticed her. He was a known snitch, a low-level informant who traded gossip for drinks. He approached her table, hesitant. "Evening, ma'am," he slurred, a false cordiality in his tone. "Travelin' alone." Eleanor met his gaze, and flinching. "I am." He fidgeted. "Ain't safe for a woman out here, especially in these parts. Heard tell of a nasty outfit operating nearby, called the Shadows Gang. They don't take kindly to strangers poking around." Eleanor leaned forward, her voice a low, compelling whisper. "What do you know about the Shadows outfit?" The man's eyes darted around, clearly nervous. "Just whispers, ma'am. But they say he's got this whole territory by the throat. Runs everything. Steals cattle, shakes down prospectors, even pays off the law in some places. And he's got a right-hand man, big brute named Silas." He stopped, realizing his mistake. "No, not Silas. Sorry. I mean, a big brute named a Grifter." "Yeah, Grifter." He corrected himself quickly, his eyes wide with fear. The actual Silas had warned her about a certain Silas who was not the outlaw, but the name Silas had slipped into this snitch's vocabulary through hearsay about a right-hand man. Eleanor's mind reeled. Silas, her mentor, had deliberately misled her about the name of the Shadow's lieutenant, perhaps to protect himself, or perhaps to test her resolve. The old bounty hunter was more complex than she'd thought, but the snitch had given her another name, Grifter, and confirmation of Rattlesnake Gulch. "What about Rattlesnake Gulch?" she pressed, her voice unwavering. The snitch blanched. "Rattlesnake Gulch. That's his stronghold, ma'am. A viper's nest. Ain't no law there but the Shadows. No one goes in, no one comes out, unless he says so. That's where he keeps his operation, his men, his business." He took a large gulp of beer, clearly unnerved. "They say he's got a personal guard, men who never leave his side. And he's got a temper. Cross him, and you just disappear." Eleanor listened intently, her brain cataloging every detail. The snitch, terrified as he was a treasure trove of information. He described the Shadow's appearance: tall, always impeccably dressed despite the dust, a silver spur on his left boot. He spoke of his lieutenants, not just Grifter, but a cunning, wary man known as Snake Eyes for his cold and blinking gaze, and a silent, hulking brute called the Mute. He also confirmed the widespread corruption, hinting that even some federal marshals looked the other way for the right price. As the snitch rambled on, his fear loosening his tongue, Eleanor realized the depth of the enemy she faced. This wasn't just a gang, it was a criminal enterprise, entrenched and protected. But with each piece of information, her resolve hardened. She finally pushed a few coins across the table. "Thank you for the information," she said, her voice a low murmur. "It's been illuminating." She left the crossroads under the cover of approaching night, the whispers of the snitch echoing in her mind. Rattlesnake Gulch, Grifter, Snake Eyes, the Mute, the Silver Spur. Her mission, once a desperate quest for vengeance, now had clear targets, distinct faces. The path ahead was treacherous, lined with danger and betrayal, but Eleanor Vance, the widow, felt a grim satisfaction. She was closer. The hunt continued. The air grew heavy, almost oppressive, as Eleanor approached Rattlesnake Gulch. The name itself was a warning, a promise of venom and deceit. The terrain transformed, becoming more desolate, more jagged, an unforgiving landscape of twisted rock formations and stunted, thorny brush. The feeling of isolation, usually a comfort, now felt like a shroud. She spotted it from a high ridge, a collection of ramshackle buildings huddled in a sun-baked canyon, clinging precariously to the dusty earth. It was a scar on the land, a festering wound of human depravity. Shacks leaned against each other, their roofs patched with tin and canvas. A single, larger building, presumably a saloon or general store, stood at the center, its weathered facade hinting at countless years of grim transactions. A pall of dust hung over the town, perpetually stirred by horses and the comings and goings of its unsavory inhabitants. This was the Shadow's domain. Eleanor dismounted, leaving Shadow hidden in a secluded hollow, covering her with a canvas tarp. She would approach on foot, moving with the stealth Silas had taught her. She replaced her duster with a worn, dusty cloak she'd bought at the crossroads, its hood pulled low to obscure her features. She tied a bandana loosely around her face, a common practice in the dusty West, further concealing her identity. Her Colt was now snug in its holster, close to her hand, a constant, weighty reassurance. She entered Rattlesnake Gulch as the midday sun beat down, casting harsh and forgiving shadows. The stench hit her first: stale whiskey, cheap tobacco, and washed bodies, and something else, a faint, metallic tang that spoke of old blood. The sounds were a discordant symphony: raucous laughter, shouts, the clinking of glasses, the jingle of spurs, and the occasional and settling crack of a distant gunshot. Men lounged on porches, their faces rough, their eyes wary, constantly assessing. Eleanor moved through them, a silent ghost, her gaze sweeping, cataloging. She saw the types Silas had described: the quick-tempered brawlers, the silent, watchful enforcers, the hollow-eyed drifters. She kept her head down, feigning weariness, a solitary figure minding her own business. Her focus was absolute: to identify the men from her ranch, to find the Shadow, and to gather intel on their routines, their weaknesses. She knew the faces of John's killers, etched into her memory with the indelible acid of grief. She specifically looked for the tall, imposing figure with the silver spur, and the brutal face of Grifter, the Shadow's right-hand man. She found them. Or rather, she found one of them first. Lounging against the wall of the saloon, spitting tobacco, was a man with a distinctive scar running from his eyebrow to his jaw, a face she knew from the night her life ended. Her blood ran cold, a furious tremor starting in her hands. This was one of them, a direct participant in John's murder. She watched him for a long time, observing his interactions, his habits. He was loud, boisterous, surrounded by a few other gang members. He wore a heavy, ornate silver buckle on his belt, a detail she recognized from the chaos of the raid. He laughed, he drank, he was oblivious to the quiet vengeance slowly tightening its grip around him. As the sun began to dip, casting long, menacing shadows, Eleanor ventured into the saloon. It was even more oppressive inside, dark and smoky, filled with the loud clatter of poker chips and the boisterous voices of hardened men. She ordered a glass of water, positioning herself in a dimly lit corner, her eyes constantly moving, searching. And there he was, the Shadow. He was at a table in the back, surrounded by his personal guard, including Grifter and the silent Hulk known as the Mute. He was impeccably dressed, as the snitch had said, in a dark suit, contrasting sharply with the rough-hewn surroundings. His hat, a pristine black Stetson, was tilted just so, casting his face in perpetual shadow. But Eleanor saw the glint of the silver spur on his left boot, reflecting the flickering lamplight. It was a detail that sent a cold wave of absolute certainty through her. He was the man who had plunged the knife into John's chest. The man who had ended her world. Her heart hammered, a primal drumbeat of rage and fear. She wanted to draw her gun, to end him right there, but Silas's voice echoed in her mind: cunning, girl. Cunning. She couldn't risk it. Not yet. Not in this den of vipers. As she watched, Grifter, a brute of a man with a thick neck and cruel eyes, barked orders at a younger gang member. The Shadow merely observed, a faint, cold smile playing on his lips, an air of quiet, absolute control emanating from him. A tense moment arose when one of the Shadow's men, a burly, drunken brute, bumped into Eleanor. He snarled, his hand going to his pistol. "Watch where you're going, old woman." Eleanor froze, her hand hovering near her Colt. This was a test, a moment of truth. She met his gaze, her eyes, though shadowed by her hood, burning with a silent and wavering intensity. She didn't speak, didn't flinch. The drunken man, momentarily taken aback by her unyielding stare, grunted, then stumbled away, perhaps sensing something dangerous, something unyielding, beneath her unassuming appearance. Eleanor allowed herself a slow, controlled breath. She had passed the test. She had navigated the venom of Rattlesnake Gulch without revealing herself. But her purpose here was not to simply observe. It was to strike. She had seen her targets. The knowledge burned within her, a cold fire. Tonight, she would begin to exact her justice. The oppressive heat of Rattlesnake Gulch lingered even after sundown, replaced by a humid, stale air that clung to the canyons. Eleanor, having slipped out of the saloon unnoticed, found a hidden perch on a rocky outcrop overlooking the main street, her silhouette blending with the jagged edges of the mountains. The town below was a hive of activity, its sounds amplified by the night, drunken revelry, barking dogs, the occasional mournful cry of a coyote. She had spent the last few hours meticulously planning her move. Her target for the night was the scarred man, the one with the silver buckle on his belt, the one she had recognized from the raid on her ranch. His name, she'd learned from overhearing a drunken conversation, was Twitch. He was a lieutenant, not as influential as Grifter or Snake Eyes, but a direct participant in John's murder, and a visible symbol of the Shadow's brutality. More importantly, he was currently alone, making his way to a small, isolated cabin on the outskirts of the gulch, a known haunt for lower-ranking gang members. Eleanor moved, a shadow amongst shadows, her footsteps silent on the dusty ground. The colt felt heavy, cold, and utterly right in her hand. Her mind was a steel trap. Every lesson from Silas resurfacing: use the environment. Know your escape route. Don't hesitate. Ever. She approached Twitch's cabin from the rear, taking cover behind a pile of discarded lumber. A single, flickering lantern cast long, dancing shadows from within the cabin, revealing Twitch's silhouette as he moved around inside. She heard him grunt, then the clink of a bottle. He was alone, settling in for the night. This was her chance. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. This was it. The next kill. The next step. She moved to the back window, finding it slightly ajar. With a soft click, she pushed it open further. The scent of cheap tobacco and stale whiskey wafted out. She saw Twitch at a small, cluttered table, pouring himself another drink. His back was to the window. Eleanor drew her Colt, the hammer clicking softly in the sudden silence. She raised the weapon, her arm steady, her aim unwavering. She pictured John's face, etched in her memory, and the image of Twitch's cruel grin as he watched her home burn. The flicker of remorse she had felt with Stumpy was gone, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. "Twitch," she whispered, her voice a low, raspy hiss, barely audible over the crackling fire in the cabin's hearth. He froze, his hand halfway to the whiskey bottle. He slowly began to turn, a look of confusion, then dawning fear, on his face. Before he could fully pivot, before his hand could even twitch towards his holstered gun, Eleanor fired. The shot was deafening in the small cabin, a sharp, violent punctuation mark in the silence of the night. The bullet struck Twitch squarely in the chest. He gasped, a guttural sound of surprise and pain, his eyes wide with disbelief, then a sudden, sickening understanding. He stumbled backward, knocking over the table, the whiskey bottle shattering on the floor. He clutched his chest, a dark, crimson stain spreading rapidly across his shirt, before collapsing, his body thudding heavily against the wooden floorboards. Eleanor stood motionless for a moment, the smoking Colt still extended. The deed was done. Another one. She felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the strange mix of cold satisfaction and hollow emptiness. But there was no lingering doubt, only grim resolve. She entered the cabin, her eyes sweeping the small room. Twitch lay dead, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. She quickly searched his pockets, finding a small pouch of coins, a worn deck of cards, and a folded, grease-stained map. Her heart quickened as she unfolded the map. It was a crude drawing, but it showed a series of intersecting trails, marked with symbols she recognized as cattle pens, and, significantly, a clearly marked route to a larger, more permanent holding facility deep within the Dead Horse Badlands, a facility she hadn't known about. This was likely where the Shadow moved his larger hauls. It was a key piece of information. As she finished her search, a sudden, muffled sound from outside caught her attention. Footsteps. Fast, urgent. Someone had heard the shot. Eleanor knew she had mere moments. She shoved the map into her duster, reholstered her Colt, and slipped out the back window, just as the cabin door burst open. A group of the Shadow's men, alerted by the gunshot, stormed inside. "Twitch! What the hell happened?" one of them yelled. Eleanor heard their shouts, their curses, their cries of alarm. She moved swiftly, melting back into the shadows, making her way towards her hidden horse. She could hear them scrambling, shouting orders, their voices filled with a new, frantic edge. The gunshot had created a ripple effect. Fear would spread through Rattlesnake Gulch now. Paranoia. The shadow would know someone was striking at his men. He would be looking for a new enemy. As she rode away from Rattlesnake Gulch, leaving the chaos behind, Eleanor felt a grim satisfaction. She had struck a blow, a clear message to the shadow. The widow had ridden for blood, and she had drawn it. But she knew this was just the beginning. The predator had now become the hunted, and the hunt had only intensified. The map, clutched in her hand, pointed to her next destination, deeper into the shadow's territory, towards a confrontation that would be far deadlier than anything she had faced before. The map, crude and grease-stained, was Eleanor's guiding star into the heart of the shadow's domain, the Dead Horse Badlands. This was a land that earned its name, a tortured landscape of sun-baked mesas, dizzying canyons, and endless, jagged ridges, where the very earth seemed to have been torn apart by some ancient, violent hand. It was a place of oppressive silence, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind and the hiss of unseen reptiles. A perfect place to hide ill-gotten gains and ruthless men. Eleanor rode for days, pushing shadow through the treacherous terrain, her canteen perpetually half-empty, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Silas's lessons on desert survival were her only companions, his gruff voice echoing in her memory. The desert ain't your friend, but it ain't your enemy either. Just as you learn its ways, you might live. She moved like a phantom, a whisper of dust in the vast emptiness, leaving no trace. Her duster, now ingrained with the grit of 100 miles, concealed her form, and her face, hardened by purpose, offered no softness to the unforgiving sun. Finally, after a grueling climb up a particularly treacherous mesa, she saw it. Nestled deep within a hidden, bowl-shaped canyon, almost perfectly camouflaged by the towering rock formations, was the shadow's secondary stronghold. It was a sprawling, makeshift camp, far larger and more organized than Rattlesnake Gulch. Numerous corrals held hundreds of rustled cattle, their lowing a constant, mournful sound. Several sturdy cabins, a large mess hall, and a blacksmith's forge were arranged around a central open area. Guards, heavily armed and alert, patrolled the perimeter. This was the true nerve center of the shadow's illicit empire. Eleanor spent the next 48 hours observing, a silent and blinking sentinel on the highest ridge. She used a battered pair of binoculars she'd acquired at the crossroads to meticulously map out the camp's layout, its routines, its weaknesses. She counted the men, identifying their roles, the perpetually watchful sentries, the loud, boisterous cattle handlers, the grim, silent enforcers who rarely left the shadow's side. She identified Grifter, his bull-like frame unmistakable, barking orders in the corrals. She saw Snake Eyes, his weary frame moving with an unsettling grace, his gaze perpetually scanning, missing nothing. And the Mute, a hulking brute of a man, whose silent presence alone seemed to radiate menace, was always near the shadow. The shadow himself cut an imposing figure. Even from this distance, his presence commanded attention. He moved with an almost aristocratic bearing, his dark clothes a stark contrast to the dust and grime. She saw the glint of the silver spur, a chilling beacon of her vengeance. He spent most of his time in the largest cabin, which she surmised was his headquarters, but occasionally emerged to oversee operations, his voice, though unheard at this distance, clearly carrying authority. Eleanor's observations revealed a crucial pattern. A supply wagon arrived every few days, bringing provisions and taking out cleaned hides and some processed meat, but never cattle. The cattle were moved out through a cleverly concealed canyon passage, a route too narrow for wagons, only for riders, suggesting a larger, more remote exchange point. But the most shocking discovery came on the second night. As the shadow held court in his headquarters, illuminated by the flickering lamplight, a new figure arrived. A man dressed in expensive, tailored city clothes, utterly out of place in this rugged stronghold. He was clean-shaven, portly, and carried himself with an air of arrogant importance. Eleanor watched as the shadow greeted him with deference, almost subservience. They disappeared into the main cabin, emerging hours later, their conversation animated, punctuated by gestures towards maps laid out on a table. Eleanor couldn't hear their words, but the visual was damning. This city man was clearly the shadow's financier, his partner, the true mastermind pulling the strings. She realized then that her ranch hadn't just been stolen for its cattle. It was part of a larger, more intricate scheme. likely for its strategic location or some hidden resource she hadn't known about. This was bigger than mere banditry. Her blood ran cold, a new layer of hatred mixing with her grief. This wasn't just about vengeance for John, it was about exposing a vast, corrupt network. She had to get inside that cabin. She had to find out who this man was, what their game truly was, and what role her ranch played in their wicked scheme. Eleanor devised a plan, audacious and perilous. She would infiltrate the stronghold during the chaotic shift change of the guards. Under the cover of the moonless night, she would target Twitch's cabin first, ensuring he was dead, then make her way to the main headquarters. She would rely on stealth, her cult, and the element of surprise. Her heart hammered with a mixture of terror and fierce determination. This was the viper's nest, and she was about to stir it. The hunt was no longer just for blood, it was for truth. The wind howled through the canyons of the Dead Horse Badlands, a mournful dirge that mirrored the tempest in Eleanor Vance's soul. Under the shroud of a moonless night, she slipped into the Shadow's stronghold, a silent wraith fueled by grim purpose. Her senses were honed, every muscle taut, every breath controlled. She moved through the maze of corrals and cabins, a ghost among the sleeping brutes. The stench of cattle and stale sweat thickened the air. Her first target was a sentry post, strategically located to cover the main approach. The guard, a sleepy-eyed brute, leaned against a rock, his rifle resting carelessly. Eleanor approached from behind, her knife glinting dully in the faint starlight. A swift, silent movement, a muffled gasp, and he slumped to the ground, a chilling testament to her evolving lethality. No shots fired, no alarms raised. The widow was becoming as skilled a hunter as any man in the West. She made her way to the main cabin, the Shadow's headquarters, her heart pounding a furious rhythm against her ribs. The faint glow of a lantern within indicated that some were still awake. She cautiously approached a back window, prying it open with a silent, practiced ease she'd learned from Silas. Inside, the Shadow sat at a table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey before him, his silver spur catching the lamplight. Across from him sat Grifter, his massive frame slumped, clearly drowsy, and Snake Eyes, his reptilian eyes still unnervingly alert, his hands resting on his holstered revolvers. The mute was nowhere to be seen, likely outside, adding another layer of danger. Another problem, boss, Grifter grumbled, his voice thick with drink. This Vance woman, she's causing too much damn trouble. We should have finished her off at the ranch. The Shadow chuckled, a low, cold sound that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. She's tenacious, I'll give her that. But ultimately foolish. She's walking into a trap. Our benefactor wants her eliminated. Quietly. And the land, Snake Eyes hissed, his voice like dry leaves skittering across rock. The Vance land. Was it truly worth all this trouble? The Shadow leaned back, a sneer on his face. More than you know, Snake Eyes. The Vance Ranch sits directly on the largest freshwater aquifer in this entire godforsaken valley. The railroad needs that water to run their operations, to expand deeper into the territory. And our esteemed Mr. Aldrich, our silent partner, has plans to divert that water, to control this entire region's development. The Vances simply had the misfortune of owning the key. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Mr. Aldrich, the city man. It all clicked into place. John had been murdered, their ranch stolen, not for cattle, but for water. For a ruthless man's grand scheme of expansion and control. Her grief curdled into a white-hot fury. She had heard enough. This was her moment. Eleanor kicked open the back door, crashing it against the wall with a deafening thud. The Shadow, Grifter, and Snake Eyes spun around, their eyes wide with shock. Eleanor stood framed in the doorway, her duster billowing, her Colt leveled, her face a mask of grim determination. The Vance woman, the Shadow whispered, his voice laced with disbelief and a flicker of genuine fear. That's right, Eleanor hissed, her voice low and dangerous. The widow. And I've come for what you owe me. Grifter, recovering quickly, roared and lunged for his gun. But Eleanor was faster. Her first bullet struck him squarely in the chest. The impact lifted him off his feet, sending him sprawling backwards, dead before he hit the floor. Snake Eyes, cunning as his namesake, dropped to the floor, throwing both his revolvers in a blur. Shots erupted, tearing through the cabin, splintering wood. Eleanor dove behind a heavy table, returning fire, the smell of gunpowder instantly filling the air. She moved with a desperate grace, honed by her training, her shots precise and deadly. One of her bullets caught Snake Eyes in the shoulder, sending him spinning, his aim faltering. The Shadow, surprisingly, didn't draw his gun immediately. Instead, he reached for a hidden compartment under the table, pulling out a small, ornate strongbox. "Foolish woman," he snarled. "You'll die here." Eleanor, seeing his distraction, seized her chance. She fired, her bullet striking Snake Eyes' gun hand, forcing him to drop his weapons with a shriek of pain. As he clutched his bleeding hand, Eleanor rose, her Colt aimed directly at the Shadow's head. "This is for John," she growled, her voice thick with years of tears and burning hatred. "This is for my home. And this is for every life you ruined for your greed." The Shadow froze, his eyes, finally visible, wide with terror. He knew this was the end. "Wait, the strongbox. It has documents. Proof. Aldrich's ledgers. He's the one. He ordered it all. He paid us," he stammered, his facade of cold control finally crumbling. "Spare me, and I'll give you everything." Eleanor hesitated for a fraction of a second. The proof. The evidence against Aldrich. This was not just about vengeance for her, it was about tearing down the entire corrupt structure. "Drop the strongbox. Kick it over here." Slowly, Eleanor commanded, her voice like steel. The Shadow, seeing no other choice, carefully slid the strongbox across the floor towards her. Just as it reached her, a hulking shadow filled the doorway. The Mute. He had heard the gunshots, and now stood there, his massive form a silent, deadly threat, a bowie knife gleaming in his hand. The Shadow saw his opportunity. "Now, Mute, kill her." As the Mute lunged, a blur of silent fury, Eleanor scooped up the strongbox with her left hand, and with her right, fired a single, devastating shot into the Shadow's head. The infamous leader of the gang crumpled without a sound, his life ending as abruptly and mercilessly as he had ended John's. Then, Eleanor spun, her Colt already tracking the Mute. He was fast, dangerously so. He lunged, his knife arcing towards her. But Eleanor, fueled by adrenaline and a primal will to survive, fired. The bullet hit him square in the chest, but his sheer momentum carried him forward. He slammed into her, his hand clutching her throat, his knife just inches from her face. Eleanor gasped for air, struggling against his immense strength. With a desperate burst of her remaining power, she drove her knee into his groin. As he momentarily recoiled, she brought the Colt up again, and fired twice more point blank, into his chest. The Mute finally staggered, a gurgling sound escaping his lips, before his massive body collapsed, taking the lantern with him. Darkness enveloped the cabin, broken only by the faint glow of the dying embers in the hearth. Eleanor lay gasping for air, clutching the strongbox, her body aching, her throat bruised. She had done it. The Shadow was dead. His lieutenants were dead. And she had the proof. The truth of Aldrich's corruption, the true motive behind John's murder, was now in her hands. She had brought justice to the viper's nest. But the deadliest serpent, Aldrich, still lurked in the shadows. The inferno that consumed the Shadow's stronghold painted the night sky a furious, blood-red. Eleanor Vance, battered and bruised, rode Shadow hard, the sturdy mare's hooves pounding a relentless rhythm against the dusty earth. In her saddlebag, clutched like a precious jewel, was the strongbox, its contents the smoking gun that would bring down the true mastermind. The Shadow's silver spur, pried from his boot as a grim trophy and undeniable proof, rested next to it. She left behind a trail of fire and dead men, a stark declaration of the widow's vengeance. Her destination was not Redemption Creek, whose sheriff she knew was either too afraid or too corrupt to act decisively against such powerful interests. Instead, she rode for a larger, more established town, Prescott, home to the territorial marshal, a man known for his unbending integrity, Marshal William Travers. Silas, in one of his rare moments of direct advice, had mentioned Travers as a man who could not be bought. The ride was grueling, a race against time and exhaustion. Eleanor pushed herself, the images of John's dying gaze and Aldrich's cold greed fueling her every breath. She ate sparingly, slept little, driven by a singular purpose, to deliver justice, not just for herself, but for all the lives the Shadow and his benefactor had ruined. She arrived in Prescott days later, a dusty, weary figure, her duster torn, her face etched with the hardships of the trail, but her eyes burning with an unshakable resolve. Marshal Travers was a man of imposing stature, with a stern face and keen, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He listened to Eleanor's incredible tale, his expression stoic, occasionally stroking his grizzled mustache. She presented the strong box, its contents a damning indictment, ledgers detailing Aldrich's illicit payments, letters outlining the plan to acquire the Vance Ranch for its water rights, even explicit orders to eliminate any resistance. She laid out the Shadow's silver spur, a tangible link to the now-dead outlaw. Her testimony, though delivered by a woman who had taken lives, was coherent, precise, and chillingly convincing. Travers examined the evidence meticulously. He sent a small, trusted team to verify her account of the destroyed stronghold, which returned with confirmation of the devastation and the bodies of the Shadow and his lieutenants. The evidence was irrefutable. The arrest of Jeremiah Aldrich, a respected and powerful railroad magnate, sent shockwaves across the territory. His name had been synonymous with progress and prosperity, but Eleanor's unwavering pursuit of justice had exposed him as a ruthless criminal, willing to commit murder and orchestrate land grabs for his own gain. The trial was sensational, dominating the headlines of every territorial newspaper. Eleanor Vance, the avenging widow, became an unlikely legend. Aldrich, despite his powerful lawyers and attempts to discredit Eleanor, was ultimately convicted, thanks to the overwhelming evidence and Eleanor's steadfast testimony. Justice, long denied, finally came to pass. Aldrich was sentenced to a long term in a federal penitentiary, his empire crumbling around him. The Vance Ranch, with its valuable water rights, was legally returned to Eleanor, along with a substantial restitution from Aldrich's seized assets. But for Eleanor, the end of the legal battle didn't bring immediate peace. The vengeance, though complete, left a hollow space where her burning hatred had been. She returned to her ranch, to the rebuilt cabin, to John's lonely grave by the creek. The land was hers again, but the man she loved was gone forever. She spent days, then weeks, simply existing, grappling with the profound emptiness that followed her bloody journey. She had achieved her purpose, but at what cost? She was no longer just a woman, she was a survivor, a killer, a legend forged in the crucible of sorrow and violence. The old Eleanor Vance was truly gone, replaced by a hardened, yet undeniably strong figure. One crisp morning, as the sun rose over the Apache Mountains, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose, Eleanor stood by John's grave. She placed her hand on the crude wooden cross. "It's done, John," she whispered, her voice soft, tinged with a weary peace. "They paid. Every last one of them." She looked out at her ranch, at the thriving cattle, at the clear, life-giving water of the spring. The land was fertile again, a symbol of renewed life. She decided then that her future would not be defined by the past, but by the possibilities of the present. She would rebuild, not just her ranch, but her life. She would ensure that no one else suffered the injustice that had torn her world apart. She would use her resources, her experience, and her unwavering resolve to protect the vulnerable, to ensure that the powerful could not simply crush the innocent. Eleanor Vance, the widow, had ridden for blood. And in doing so, she had not only found justice, but she had also forged a new path for herself, a legacy of strength and unwavering conviction in the untamed heart of the American West. She was a legend, not of vengeance, but of enduring justice, rising from the ashes, forever etched into the dust and the winds of the Arizona Territory.